All right, let's get started. Thank you very much for joining our webinar today. We appreciate your taking the time to join us and learn about how to maximize revenue with proven techniques to grow your service exports. I'll start with just a couple of points of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. We'll post a link to the webinar. You'll get an email from me with a link to the webinar so you can go back and rewatch any sections that you like. In addition, we do have a portion for questions. We'll take questions at the end. So what I'd like to ask is that you type your questions into the Q&A section during the session, and we'll answer questions at the end. And with that, I'll tell you a little bit about the World Trade Center of Northern California. We focus on making trade easier for businesses of all sizes. We're part of the World Trade Center Association. There are over 300 World Trade Centers all around the world and over 90 in the United States, the headquarters of which is the one that we all know of in New York City. We, however, are located in Sacramento, and we serve the northern 36 counties of California. I'd like to make a special note and thank you to the Northern California Small Business Development Centers, also known as the NorCal SBDC. They are our funding partners, and they allow us to do this work and bring these educational opportunities and fabulous speakers to businesses throughout Northern California. We're an SBDC affiliate and a technical assistance provider for businesses in need of exporting, importing, or e-commerce and website support. We have a very deep bench of subject matter experts in areas of international trade, including importing and exporting, as well as in US and global e-commerce. One of our areas of focus is education. We help businesses by providing high quality education, and this webinar is a good example of that. Today, you're going to hear from one of our wonderful subject matter experts supporting service providers in the areas of global growth and business development. A second area of focus is access to resources. We connect people to the trade ecosystem with resources to help grow your business, whether it's logistics, financing, e-commerce, connections to one of our partners like the SBDC, the U.S. Commercial Service, Exim Bank, the SBA, or local economic development agencies. We can help with that. In addition, we have a worldwide network of partners through the World Trade Center Association. That's enough about us. Let's get started. Please allow me to introduce you to our speaker today. Sarita Jackson is PhD and a certified global business professional. She's bilingual, international trade consultant, and specializes in advising firms on market research and strategic development. She's also the CEO of the Global Research Institute of International Trade, which is an LA-based global consulting firm. Sarita has worked on international trade projects throughout Latin America, the Caribbean, and South African regions. And her most recent book was published most recently by International Trade and Services, Effective Practice and Policy. And I will pass it along to you, Sarita. Please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Kimberly. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to have you here to discuss and be a part of this very important conversation when it comes to how to grow your business, increase the revenue, maximize the revenue in your firm by exporting a service. And yes, if you are a service provider, you can also export. Exporting is not just for tangible goods such as manufactured products or commodities, agricultural commodities. So before we get into talking about how do we export a service so that we can increase our revenue, I want to just share a little bit about my story, how I got into this space of exporting a service. So several years ago, over 10 years ago, but we'll just say several years ago, I had completed my PhD at Brown University. And instead of going into academia, I decided, well, I want to see how things work on the ground. I enjoyed learning about the theory when it comes to international economy, But I also want to see, well, how do things work on the ground at the micro level, specifically when it comes to international trade from a policy perspective, a practical perspective. So after I completed my doctorate, I was hired to work for a small consulting firm based in Arlington, Virginia. And I remember the first day was I was very excited to have this position so that I can understand the world of consulting, going from academia, where you're more theoretically focused, to now consulting. And the focus is not on developing new theory, but developing practices that will work, that are effective. And with this consulting firm, that's what I was hired to do, to consult on international trade matters. But by the afternoon, let's say about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on my first day, the vice president stopped me in the hall and he had this very interesting question. He says, "Do you have a passport?" And quite naturally, as someone who loves to travel, I said, "Yes, I do have my passport." "Great," was the response, "because now we are going to send you on a ground mission tomorrow." Now, mind you, this is my very first day at this firm. And by day 2, working at this firm, I am being sent over to the Eastern Caribbean region to do some work for this consulting firm. And that was the start of my exporting a service journey. Now, on that trip, I mentioned ground trip, I was to go and travel to Antigua and collect information that we were using just about what businesses, especially the small businesses, are facing when they are trying to compete in the global market, what government policies are put in place to help those small businesses so that they could become competitive, and things of that nature, and understanding the infrastructure, what types of rules, regulations, infrastructure to support those small businesses. Take that information, put it into a proposal where we were bidding on a contract. We won that contract, and I was sent back now to provide consulting services. And as a result of that, this just gives you a sense of some of the places and the focus of those projects. As a consultant, advising on how small, mid-sized enterprises could compete in the global economy. And as I mentioned, the first stop for me was Antigua and Barbuda. So I spent time in Antigua working with the small businesses, first understanding some of the challenges that they faced and using that information to develop practices and to advise both the businesses and the government on how they can build the capacity for the businesses in that community to compete globally, which in turn would grow their economies. Dominica, also in the Eastern Caribbean region, where I had an opportunity to travel and work in Dominica and do the same thing with Antigua, working with the government officials, the small business associations, meeting with some of the individual small business owners to develop their competitiveness. And again, this is a US-based consulting firm, and we are providing our service in another market. Botswana, another place in the Southern African region, directly north of South Africa, doing the same thing, working with the governments and the businesses on providing the types of information that they need so that those small businesses could compete and take advantage of trade programs, trade policies. In the case of Botswana, a trade program to promote trade between the United States and different countries, eligible countries throughout the African continent, known as the African Growth and Opportunities Act. So that was the focus of that project, as well as promoting trade, cross-border trade among the countries in the Southern African region. So that's my start when it comes to exporting a service. So when as Kimberly mentioned, I have my own firm. So when I started my own company on advising businesses on exporting, a lot of people would come to me on exporting a good. But as I continue to offer sessions such as these, I noticed the majority of the people in the room were service providers. And being a services-based exporter myself, that's where it became very imperative to provide information to service providers that they can also use to participate in the global economy, grow their businesses, and the growth of those businesses help the economy. And as I mentioned, I continued on with exporting a service even beyond that experience with that consulting firm, which started my journey, traveling to the Dominican Republic on a Fulbright scholarship. Now, at that time, I had transitioned back into academia. I was a professor conducting research on the trade agreement between the Dominican Republic, Central American countries, and the United States. However, while on that Fulbright fellowship, I received contracts that had nothing to do with the academic research to travel throughout the Dominican Republic and to Costa Rica, for example, of the Central American countries, to give seminars on this trade agreement, it's known as the Dominican Republic Central American Free Trade Agreement, or DR-CAFTA, what this means for the producers in those countries and how they can leverage it and still compete under these different trade programs or trade agreements. So by receiving those contracts, getting paid in another market, I'm exporting a service, a professional service, in my case, consulting and advisory services. And when it comes back to focusing on Africa, the same thing, providing different types of consulting or advisory services, working with African countries on how they can boost their trade, be competitive, how the producers in those markets can be competitive in the global economy, do business with the United States. And that has entailed my journey today, continue to working with a network of advisors from different organizations to fulfill that need. So that's my journey when it comes to exporting a service and taking that experience to share with you so that you can be a part of the services export trend. So as we begin our journey through the process together today, I just want to kind of highlight where we're going and what you can expect from today's session. So first, we're going to talk about what do we mean when we say services exports, because that can mean a whole range of things. So I'll start off talking about what I mean by services exports. Then we will look at the importance of services trade in international business. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes that gets overlooked because we're focusing on manufacturing. So we will look at why this is so important, why we are here, and how to leverage that in terms of looking at the importance of services trade. Then we'll look at some case studies, looking at the services-based companies and their performance overall. And then I will share some information based on working with services-based companies and helping them to export as well. Then we will look at 3 simple steps to get started and go in detail about that, and then end up with the next steps where you can get started right away with the information that has been presented here today. So I'm going to start with the first bullet point, the defining services exports. When I'm referencing services exports, it's mainly the professional services, such as transportation, logistics services, architect. A lot of times we see this when I've worked on overseas projects, working with architectural firms, legal services, accounting services, or the financial services. And as I've described, with consulting, advisory services, travel, leisure, hospitality. That's what I'm discussing, or that's what I'm referencing when I say services exports, professional services, also digital marketing. So any professional type of service, that is what I mean when I talk about services exports for today's session. Now, again, many of you may have heard in the news or talking about the US economy or the global economy, and there's such a focus on manufacturing, supply chain issues, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, that discussion ignores the reality of what is happening when it comes to international trade, particularly with regard to services trade. So just looking at some numbers here, the top exporters of services to the world, the United States is the leading services exporter to the world as of 2022. Now, this is still the same even today. The numbers have increased in terms of how much we export to the world, but just to have a comprehensive overview of how the United States compares to other countries, we're looking at 2022, the most recent full data that's available. And we export over $900 billion worth of services exports, followed by the United Kingdom and China, both of which are over $400 billion. The United Kingdom, $494 billion, or so slightly under $500 billion, and then China, $424 billion. Now, what does this mean to me? So I'm one of those, I'm a small business owner myself. When I sit at these webinars and I want to know, okay, that's great, these numbers, what does it mean for me? Well, the key thing that I want to continue to stress is by getting the information today, we want to see where you become a part of that $929 billion or more, depending on what it was since 2022, but be a part of the $1 billion now into the $1 trillion worth of services exports that the United States sends out to the world. And this just illustrates that there are opportunities and there are service providers who are actually exporting, and you can too. Services and the US economy. As we can see here, from 2018 to 2021, the most recent data available, that the services sector represents the majority of the US economy. As of 2021, 77.6% of our GDP. Again, why is this important? What does it mean to me as a small business owner, or to us as small business owners? Is that this shows that the United States depends on services. There are opportunities, and services has a huge impact on our economy. Going back to what I was saying earlier, as services-based companies export, while they are growing their revenue, it also comes back and helps the US economy, which continues, it's a circle, helps the growth of their business. The US trade balance, to show how important the services exports are for the United States when it comes to our trade balance. Now, for years, we have had a negative trade balance. So if you see these two blocks here to the left, trade balance for 2022 and 2023, we are in the negative, over $900 billion worth of $900 billion of a negative trade balance. So what does that mean? When we measure the trade balance, that is looking at, well, how much does the United States export compared to how much we import? The reason why that trade balance is negative is because we import, meaning we're buying more from the overseas market from different countries around the world than we are selling or exporting to that market. So we have a negative trade balance. And a lot of that is driven by the fact that when we break it down to goods, the tangible goods, we are buying more than we are selling overseas. So that's why you see the red here means that there is a negative balance for goods in 2022 and 2023, even though it improved somewhat from one year to the next, there still is a negative trade balance. But when we look at services, you see services, there is a surplus. And because of the surplus, the trade balance is not as high. The negative trade balance is not as bad as it could be. A surplus, that means that the United States exports or provides or sells more services internationally than it purchases, than it brings in or imports. So again, this is to illustrate the strong role of services in the US economy, what it means for your business. But then we also see that that surplus has increased to show, okay, from 2022 to 2023. Now that those are two crucial years because we were slowly coming out of the pandemic. And while there was still discussion about supply chain issues, et cetera, services, as I'm going to show, services remained resilient and showed growth. So looking here, when we talk about global trade and services, we see that from 2018 all the way to 2023, that we've seen growth. Now, 2020, we see a slight decline, but that was the start of the global health pandemic caused by the coronavirus. But from 2020 to 2023, we see where those numbers have gone up. Okay, now again, for us as service providers or anyone that's interested in starting to export a service, this information is very important even at the firm level or our business, because it shows that even in times of uncertainty or when you have something such as the global health pandemic or any other kind of unexpected event that can affect the global economy or affect local economies and businesses within those industries and businesses within those economies, that we see with services, we still see growth. And then when we look at from 2018 to 2023, a significant amount of growth. So just put yourself, your business in these numbers, saying, okay, now that I see that services exports, that there's a significant amount of services exports, we see continued growth, steady growth with services exports, then my business as a services-based company can be a part of those success stories, those numbers. So how do we get started? Now that we have seen how important the services or international trade when it comes to services is to at the economic level, but also what it means for our businesses, here are 3 steps to get started. The first thing when exporting a service is it's very important to select a market, but to do it systematically, because I can tell a number of stories where a small company will select a market randomly or because that the person knows someone in another market and things don't work out very well. This is where being very systematic about your approach helps. And to do that on the front end to save a lot of errors, costly errors, time, energy, and money on the back end. So by selecting one target market that makes sense for the company and the service, we do that through market research and analysis. So that's some of the work that we do here at the World Trade Center, Northern California, or working with clients, is to do the research to say, okay, let's look at some potential markets for your particular service, whether it's consulting or an architectural firm or a architect or construction company, to do the research to say, okay, here is a market where there may be ease of access to that market. The opportunities are great to enter that market. There is a demand for that particular service. And so through that research, that is used to say, this is why this is the best market for your company to consider at least starting out with exporting, as opposed to just kind of randomly or because, as I mentioned earlier, you know someone in that market. So to take that systematic approach. And then the analysis is what drives number two. So I'm going to talk about the analysis, then get into the export strategy. But it's the analysis that drives the strategy, because now that you have the information about a particular market, let's say Mexico or Canada, because they're here, easy to access, Mexico or Canada, then to do a deeper analysis of those markets, not just, well, here are the opportunities, but to look at some trends. What do we expect when you have political changes, when you have different policies? What is happening politically that can affect those policies, that may have an impact on your ability to access those markets, and not only access those markets, but stay in those markets for a significant period of time? What is happening economically that can have an impact, your competitors in that market? So those are the types of things that we look at with the analysis, and then create a story that makes sense for your business, your services-based business, to say, okay, well, here are the opportunities. These are some challenges you may face. And then leading into number two, the developing an export strategy. This is how we are going to approach that market. Now, in addition, the thing that I really want to highlight that is very, very important, not just doing the market research, understanding what is happening in Mexico or Canada or any other market around the world, it's very important to also do an in-depth assessment of your company. What that means is, if I go to a market and let's say there may be some regulatory barriers that I may have to face, or that we have to face entering that particular market, that's something that you need to be aware of. When we talk about goods, we often hear about tariffs, those taxes that are placed on goods that enter another market, and that has an impact on your competitiveness. Well, as a service provider, quite naturally, you don't have the tariffs because you're not exporting a physical good. However, there are other barriers, and depending on the market, that may be very high, some low, but there are barriers that you need to be aware of that can have an impact on your ability to enter that market. And why are these barriers important? Is because as a small business, I may not have the necessary resources to try to get into that market if I have to overcome a significant amount of barriers or hurdles to enter that market. So that's why it's very important to do a company assessment. What resources are available? And when I say resources, financial resources, as well as your human resources, your human capital. Who do you have in your company that has the knowledge and the skills to expand internationally? That is very, very important. Your capabilities, your capacity to expand to another market. So this is where being very, very honest is very important on the front end, so that when we connect the market research with the strategy, with the based on doing this company assessment, we can say, all right, well, these are some of the things you will encounter in this market. You have the resources to enter this market and stay in the market, or you need to develop the capacity and the capability to enter this market. And again, this is taking from the experience that I described in the very beginning with my export journey. This is a lot of what we did with working with companies to do what we call trade facilitation and capacity building, really build their capacity internally so that they can actually facilitate or be engaged in international trade. The tactics, that's where we lay out what are the specific things that need to be done so that as a services-based company, you can export successfully to another market and develop a roadmap. Now, usually when I work with clients, I do a roadmap that's a little over a year to say, okay, let's break this down. This is the end goal, what we need to achieve. These are the steps along the way, and break it down into small milestones so that we can break it down into smaller pieces so that it's not so overwhelming, and step by step over a period, let's say, just for the sake of an example, 1 month, we complete this step. Month number 2, another step to get you on the path to exporting a service, entering another market, and staying there for the long term. And then finally, to identify the relevant resources. So any areas where, after this company assessment and looking at the market research, to determine, well, what resources do we already have and what resources do we need to access? And that's where some of the financial support, one here with the state of California is the STEP grant, the State Trade Expansion Program, STEP, S-T-E-P, as in Paul, the STEP grant, which is an option from the financial side, a grant to help small business exporters, and then other additional assistance. And so when Kimberly was talking about some of the different resources that are available, these are some of the other resources within our network that you can tap into to help out with regard to expanding globally. Right. So now we're bringing this down to our business. So you have the bigger picture. And even though I kept relating it to our business, now let's really see what that looks like. So when we're talking about services-based companies that export and what success looks like, mainly what we see is that they do see an increase in revenue, a boost in employee wages, and an increase in productivity. Now, the information here is based on studies, and then I'll talk about working with a particular client this year. But this is just based on studies looking at the services exports, first of all, adding to the field because there's not much out there when it comes to services exports. And so now we're seeing more and more studies looking at a collective number of small, mid-sized enterprises as they export and see what the results are. And what we have seen from reports from the Brookings, based in Washington, D.C., and the World Economic Forum, is that many of your services-based exporters doubled the amount of sales revenues in the midst of the global recession, going back to 2007, 2009 period, compared to non-exporters. Now, that is very important. I really do want to highlight that. Now, the numbers that I gave when I was talking about, we see services exports remaining resilient during the global health pandemic in recent years. But even we can look even further back to the global recession. And even services-based exporters still were able to increase their sales during a time of uncertainty. And that is important to consider because it's not just about maximizing your revenue, but also having the stability to continue to generate revenue when there's some uncertainty, unexpected events happen, in this case with the economy here in the United States and globally. So when we look at those numbers for the exporters, they were still able to double their sales, whereas the non-exporters were not. When it comes to the wages, according to these studies looking at SME, services-based exporters, that those services-based companies that were exporting were able to pay 20% higher wages compared to non-exporters. And then the last part, when it comes to being more productive, that, and this is some statistical analysis, but we'll just keep it simple, that the index, higher productivity index for the services exporters compared to, now in this case, goods, not non-service exporters, but compared to exporters of goods, tangible goods, was 19.9% compared to 13.8% for goods exporters. Okay, so that gives us a view, again, of looking collectively, not just one or two companies, but collectively at services-based companies that are exporting and how they have performed. And all of this performance is what goes into some of the numbers that we saw earlier, looking at the United States as well as the global services trade. Okay, so also with that, I'm going to talk about one of the clients, and I'm going to just kind of back up here so that you can see how this approach helped a client that I worked with. So there was an individual a small company. He owns a small company in the educational space. That's another one. So anyone in education, that's another service that you provide. Myself, consulting, but even during the pandemic, providing educational services. I did a lot of that where I was exporting service, providing education as it pertained to international trade. So now working with this gentleman in the educational space, we went through these steps so that he could reach or expand. Actually, he had already started exporting, so he wasn't new to export. He had many of his students here in the United States. He started reaching students in another market, but the question was, how do I expand in that particular market? So we went back and followed these steps where we, instead of, well, he already had the market, so the selecting one market, target market was already done. Nevertheless, it still was, how do we do research so he could expand? Because the students that he had, it was 1 or 2 students, were because of referrals. So it wasn't really the systematic approach, it was because of referrals. But he thought, well, how can I really expand in this particular market, or should I look at another market? So he kind of looked at another market, but it just made sense. If you're already in this particular market, it just made sense to expand, to really leverage that. See if you can go beyond the 1 or 2 students that you received due to a referral because of a personal connection, and see if you can really grow and be the go-to for your service, your educational service, or the type of educational service. So we went through, and I worked with him, conducted some market research on that particular market, provided him with the information, the analysis, such as consumer behavior, understanding the demographics, the resources. And when I say resources, meaning who to reach out to, if there are government agencies or any nonprofit organizations or private sector organizations or associations that he could reach out to help him to get the word out about his particular educational service in that market. Once we were able to do that, then we developed a strategy. Okay, we have all of this in our hand. Now, what do we do with it? To develop a strategy, we had gone through an assessment of his company. He was generating a good amount of revenue so that he could carry out what we talked about. Again, as I was stressing, that company assessment is very, very important, to be honest up front than to say, yeah, I'll just start exporting, and then you're finding out there are a number of costs along the way that you need to be aware of and don't really have the resources to take that on. So with him, we did an assessment of his company, laid out a roadmap. Okay, this is what we need to do each step of the way. Now, in this case, it was mostly outreach. That was really the case because, again, we already had the market selected because he came to me with that market. He was already exporting and looking to expand. So the question was, okay, our focus was more so on the outreach so that he could get the connections with other people that aren't personal connections to help spread the word about his service. As far as the relevant resources, we didn't have to bring in we didn't have to bring any additional resources, but nonetheless, for those on the call, still think about the STEP grant and any other kind of resources that can help, that we will also go over again at the end of this presentation. But for the case of this particular client, we didn't really need to tap into the STEP grant or anything like that. And by early this year, by early of 2024, when I reached out to see how things were going, well, yes, he did. He saw an increase in his sales, just slightly under 10%, but it was really significant because dollar value wise, now he is a 6-figure company. From where he started when we were working together, now he's a 6-figure company and continuing to grow. But that's how this systematic approach helped that one client. Okay. So the next steps so that you can get started right away is to complete the World Trade Center client application, and that will be provided for you in the chat. The information will be provided for you or to you, and also in a follow-up email. And then to connect with a consultant. if you like what you heard today, feel free. We can connect and learn more, have a session where we can talk specifically about your company and where to go. And again, it's following these 3 simple steps to get started on selecting that export market, doing so systematically, developing a sound strategy, and identifying the relevant resources that would make sense for your company, and getting you exporting right away, or if you're already exporting, expanding in the export market, your services. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sarita Jackson. That was wonderful. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A, excuse me. And Sarita, if you would go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit before we answer questions, I'll tell you a little bit more about the program that we've been referencing throughout this webinar. Thanks to a grant from the NorCal Small Business Development Centers, we at the World Trade Center of Northern California are able to provide no-cost support in the areas of importing, exporting, cross-border, and U.S. e-commerce. And Dr. Jackson is one of our counselors, as I mentioned. So if you're interested in working with her to learn more about how to either start or grow your service export business, please complete the form. You can also reach out to me directly. My email is here on the screen, and I'll also put it in the chat for you. And you can learn more from me. We can talk about your business, what your goals are, and then I can assign a counselor to you. And again, this is no cost support provided thanks to a grant from the Northern California SBDC. We also, through this program, so in addition to being an economic development program, this is a workforce development program. We recruit, train, and pay community college students, and they become interns working for the World Trade Center to support businesses. So you have the added benefit, in addition to these this kind of broad bench of experts, you have the added benefit of intern support. So in terms of questions, I don't have anything open in the chat right now, so I'll just ask Dr. Jackson a couple of questions that I have. My first question is, what types of services are doing the best right now or have the best potential?
So one of the services, transport, has been doing very well, and logistics. And I do want to mention that because there was something I also want to highlight when we're talking about services, and for if anyone is in the logistics space, because when you think about it with services, well, goods can't move without transport services, right? They would just be stuck at home. So logistics, warehousing, those are very important services that allows for the movement of goods, whether they're manufactured goods or agricultural goods, food products, things of that nature. So we really see it with the numbers, it's the transport and logistics.
That's interesting. I would not have thought of those, so thank you for sharing that. And then my other question for you was, what specifically does the market research that you do entail?
Good question. So with the market research, so I gave kind of a very general, broad overview with market research, but it can be very pointed, starting off with just looking at international trade statistics. Starting off with that, there's a number of different databases out there, but looking at the trade statistics, credible trade statistics, to see what are we seeing with services. And yes, there are databases that track services to see what the trends are when it comes to different types of professional services. So I'll just throw out travel. What are we seeing with travel going to export of travel to X market, or finding the top markets? So that's the first thing, looking at the trade statistics. The research also looks at what's happening internally in a market. So the political side, which I briefly mentioned, looking at, because that's very important, honestly. I've seen it when clients will go to, or someone I know, even if they aren't a client, go to a particular market, things change politically, then either they can stay in that market or may not stay. So what's happening politically, policy wise, and economically in that market. Now, technology, very, very important to understand the rules, the regulations. So it really gets deep into what's happening at the international level in terms of the trade, but what is happening internally in that market to make sure that is the right market, not just, oh, because we see these trade numbers and they're continuing to grow in terms of exports to that market, or we don't see anything, that might mean there's an opportunity, but to really look at internally what's going on, understanding that sometimes that can even, many times, actually, not sometimes, many times, where I'll have contacts on the ground where I can say, hey, could you just give me a little bit of information about this or that? We're going in this direction, so that we know that once you access that market or enter that market, that you can stay there, that we do as much kind of forecasting, if you will, so that we think ahead. You can only think ahead so far, but as best as possible, so that when you spend all that time, energy, and money going to a market, you can be there not just for 6 months or a year. So that's what that research entails, research and analysis.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. We've just had one question. Well, we've had two questions. One was about the grant. And it said, I just saw your grant offer 2 days ago. When is the next opportunity and will you extend the deadline? So if you're referring to the STEP grant, that is not something that we control. That's a program run by the state of California. So the website that I put into the chat, that's the link you would want to follow to get more information about that. But that program runs kind of on a quarterly basis, and the funds are dispersed essentially on a quarterly basis. It's dependent on the state budget. And the second question is, do I have to live in that state that current grant offers? So yes, the STEP grants are state specific. And so the rules are state specific, but there are STEP grants in every state. So depending on the state that you're in, you can go to their STEP grant site and understand the rules and what applies and what they cover. And I think that was the end of the questions. So thank you very much to everyone for joining the webinar today. And again, I encourage you to reach out to me with any questions at my email address, which is kvitel, VUITEL at NorCalWTC. I'm going to start over again, at NorCalWTC.org, and to follow the link and get some information about our client application. Thank you very much for joining, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.